Hey guys, tonight we're talking about one of history's greatest disappearing acts, the missing tomb of Cleopatra, the most famous queen of the ancient world, ruled Egypt, terrified Rome, broke multiple empires emotionally, and somehow misplaced her own grave. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. When Cleopatra died, she did not exit history politely. There was no gentle fade out, no quiet retirement into the afterlife, no thank you all for coming moment. Cleopatra did not do subtle, she did dramatic, carefully planned dramatic. The kind of dramatic that lingers for over 2,000 years and still refuses to provide directions. This was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman who ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth, spoke several languages fluently, and managed to negotiate with Rome while simultaneously being underestimated by it. Cleopatra understood power the way most people understand rent, constantly, anxiously, and with deep strategic awareness. She also understood legacy, which is why the idea of her having a casual, poorly planned burial is almost insulting. Ancient Egypt treated tombs like eternity projects. Pharaohs didn't just get buried, they launched posthumous branding campaigns. Tombs were designed to scream, "I was important, I am still important, and you will remember me forever." Cleopatra grew up surrounded by this mindset. She knew exactly how burial worked. She knew it mattered, and she absolutely would not have left it to chance, fate, or a stressed-out priest with a clipboard, which makes the situation deeply awkward. We know where minor nobles were buried. We know the resting places of officials whose greatest achievement was owned a vineyard, or once annoyed the tax office. We even know where some fairly forgettable rulers ended up. But Cleopatra, arguably the most famous woman of the ancient world, has no confirmed tomb. None. No signposts. No helpful "you are here" marker. This isn't mysterious in a fun, whimsical way. This is suspicious. Cleopatra curated her image relentlessly. She aligned herself with Isis. She staged her appearances. She controlled how she was seen, spoken about, and remembered. Even her death was orchestrated to deny Rome a public victory parade. This was not someone who said, "Just bury me wherever there's space." If anything, her tomb should have been impossible to miss. Lavish, symbolic, loud in the way stone monuments are loud. A final reminder that she ruled Egypt on her own terms. And yet, instead of a monument, we have absence. No tomb, no body, no closure. Which suggests one of two things. Either someone worked very hard to erase her final resting place, or Cleopatra, true to form, planned one last disappearance. And nailed it. If Cleopatra did one thing consistently throughout her life, it was control the narrative. She did not simply exist. She curated. She understood that power wasn't just armies and gold. It was how stories were told, who told them, and whether you let your enemies hold the microphone. So when the end came, Cleopatra treated death not as a defeat, but as her final public appearance. According to ancient sources, her death was deliberate, controlled, and extremely inconvenient for Rome. Octavian wanted her alive, preferably humiliated, paraded through the streets, and added to his victory resume. Cleopatra responded by doing the one thing Rome couldn't undo, dying on her own terms, which frankly is a bold move when your opponent controls half the known world. This matters because people who stage their deaths carefully tend to stage everything else carefully too. Cleopatra didn't panic. She didn't flee. She didn't beg. Ancient writers describe her arranging her final moments with the same calm precision she used for political negotiations. There were costumes, there were rituals, there were attendants. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And if death itself was planned like a performance, then the burial was not going to be an afterthought. No one who micromanages their own exit says, figure out the tomb later. Cleopatra knew the symbolic weight of funerary rituals in Egypt. She knew how bodies, tombs, and placement shaped memory. She also knew that once she was gone, Rome would rewrite her story however it pleased. So she planned ahead. Sources tell us she prepared a tomb before her death, not hurriedly, not in desperation, but deliberately. A structure designed to hold both her and Mark Antony together, which, from Rome's perspective, was deeply annoying. A shared tomb meant shared legacy. It turned a Roman victory into a tragic love story instead of a clean political win. Cleopatra was very good at that sort of thing. She also understood something Rome hated. Symbols outlive armies. A tomb could become a pilgrimage site. A monument could inspire loyalty long after a queen was gone. And Cleopatra had no intention of letting Rome control her image in death any more than she had in life. So when she died, she didn't vanish randomly. She exited with intent, with planning, with a final act of defiance wrapped in ritual, which brings us to the uncomfortable realization that follows naturally from all of this. If Cleopatra's death was staged with care, then her missing tomb was not an accident. It was part of the performance. Ancient sources agree on one detail that would have made Rome sigh deeply and rub its temples. Cleopatra was buried with Mark Antony, not nearby, not in neighbouring plots like polite exes, together, side by side, eternally linked, which, from a Roman public relations standpoint, was an absolute disaster. Rome wanted a clean ending, a decisive victory. Antony as a failed general, Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign queen who lost. What they got instead was a tragic romance that refused to stay quiet. A shared burial meant their story didn't end with defeat. It ended with loyalty, drama, and the kind of emotional symbolism Romans pretended not to understand, while absolutely understanding it. This wasn't just personal, it was political. A joint tomb would turn two defeated enemies into a legend. It would invite sympathy. It would encourage locals to remember Cleopatra not as Rome's trophy, but as Egypt's queen who chose love and dignity over humiliation. For an empire that thrived on controlling narratives, this was deeply inconvenient, and Cleopatra knew it. She understood that burial arrangements speak louder than victory speeches. Kings and queens are remembered not just by how they ruled, but by where they rest. A shared tomb tells a story without words. It says, "We stood together, we chose each other. You did not break us." Rome could conquer territory, but symbolism, that was harder to occupy. Ancient writers even mention that the tomb was sealed quickly after their deaths, which is interesting because sealing a tomb quickly usually means one of two things: urgency or secrecy. Either Rome wanted the story contained immediately, or Cleopatra had already ensured that the site would not remain accessible for long. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that a shared tomb made it harder to erase just one of them. Destroy Antony's memory, and Cleopatra's remains would still be there. Erase Cleopatra, and Antony's presence would linger. Together, they became a problem that couldn't be neatly separated. Which raises an obvious question. If Rome disliked the symbolism of their shared burial so much, why let it stand at all? The answer may be that they didn't, at least not for long. A tomb honouring both Antony and Cleopatra would have been too powerful to ignore, too visible, too emotionally charged, and Rome was very good at making uncomfortable things quietly disappear. So if the tomb was sealed, then hidden, then forgotten, that wasn't neglect, that was strategy. And once again, Cleopatra's final move may have been to bind her legacy so tightly to Antony's that removing one meant losing control of both. Rome hated that, which usually means it worked. Cleopatra's tomb was never meant to be just a place where bones politely waited for eternity. In ancient Egypt, tombs were statements, political ones, religious ones, sometimes personal ones. but almost always loaded with meaning. And if there is one thing Cleopatra never did, it was underestimate the power of symbolism carved in stone. This was a woman who aligned herself with Isis, not metaphorically, not casually, but publicly and deliberately. Cleopatra presented herself as the living embodiment of the goddess, a ruler chosen by divine order, not Roman convenience. That alone tells us something important. Her tomb was almost certainly designed to reflect that identity. This wouldn't have been a quiet underground box with a name scratched on the wall. It would have been theatrical, sacred, impossible to ignore. Ancient accounts suggest the tomb was filled with treasure, gold, silver, ritual objects, and offerings meant to secure divine favor in the afterlife. That's normal for royalty. What's not normal is how politically explosive that would have been after Rome's conquest. A lavish tomb honoring Cleopatra would effectively say, she ruled here, she mattered, Rome did not erase her. And Rome had very strong feelings about being told no. This is where the danger comes in. A tomb like that wouldn't just attract mourners. It would attract loyalty, pilgrimages, whispered admiration. Stories told quietly among Egyptians who remembered her not as a defeated enemy, but as their queen. Rome understood this perfectly. Empires are not threatened by weapons alone. They are threatened by memory. A visible, accessible tomb would have become a problem almost immediately, not because of rebellion, necessarily, but because of reverence. People gathering, people remembering, people telling their children that once Egypt was ruled by someone who didn't answer to Rome. And Cleopatra would have known that too. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the tomb was designed to be found and then lost. A structure meant to exist, to be sealed, to be acknowledged, and then to vanish from reach, protected by obscurity rather than guards. Because a hidden tomb is still powerful. It denies your enemies a victory. It denies them control. And it leaves behind something far worse than a monument. A question. Rome could destroy statues. Rome could rewrite histories. But a missing tomb? That leaves imagination to do the damage. And imagination, as history repeatedly proves, is far harder to conquer. When Octavian, later known as Augustus, took control of Egypt, he inherited more than territory. He inherited a narrative problem. Rome had won the war, yes, but Cleopatra had not gone quietly, obediently, or in a way that made Octavian's victory feel neat. And Rome loved neat endings, preferably with a parade. Octavian had planned to march Cleopatra through Rome as a living warning. This is what happens when you challenge us. Instead, she denied him that spectacle by dying on her own terms, which meant the next best thing, controlling her memory, became absolutely essential. A grand tomb honouring Cleopatra was a nightmare scenario, not because Rome feared a dead woman rising from the grave, but because symbols have a way of refusing to stay dead. A lavish tomb would tell Egyptians that their queen still mattered, that she was worthy of reverence, that Rome had conquered the land, but not the story. Augustus was many things, but careless was not one of them. He understood optics the way modern politicians understand cameras, instinctively and obsessively. Allowing Cleopatra's tomb to become a public monument would undermine everything he was trying to build, an image of Rome as inevitable, dominant, and unquestioned. And here's the awkward part. Augustus also claimed to respect Egyptian traditions. Publicly, at least. He couldn't just smash the tomb without appearing like a cultural vandal. That would provoke resentment, resistance, unpleasant murmuring. So instead, Rome likely chose a subtler path. Silence. No grand announcements, no recorded destruction, just a quiet disappearance from official memory. The tomb is mentioned, then it isn't. Ancient writers suddenly lose interest. The trail goes cold, which in historical terms is rarely an accident. It's usually policy. Augustus didn't need to destroy Cleopatra's legacy. He just needed to suffocate it. Let the tomb be sealed. Let access be restricted. Let time and neglect do the work. Empires are very patient when it comes to erasing inconvenient symbols. And it worked. Within a generation, Cleopatra became a Roman cautionary tale instead of an Egyptian queen. Her image was reshaped. Her tomb, once dangerous, became irrelevant. Or at least, that's what Rome hoped. But here's the thing. Suppression only works when people forget. And Cleopatra refused to be forgettable. So the tomb vanished from maps, records, and memory. But not from curiosity. Not from legend. Not from the uncomfortable feeling that something important was deliberately hidden. Augustus solved his immediate problem. History inherited a much bigger one. What's striking about Cleopatra's missing tomb is not the violence of its disappearance, but the absence of violence. Ancient sources never describe Roman soldiers smashing it to pieces or crowds tearing it down in rage. There is no dramatic account of fire, collapse, or righteous destruction. Instead, something far more unsettling happens. The tomb simply fades. And in history, fading is rarely accidental. Rome was very good at erasing things without making a scene. Loud destruction creates martyrs. Quiet erasure creates footnotes. If you wanted Cleopatra's legacy to shrink without inspiring rebellion, you didn't smash her tomb. You let it close, seal, and slowly slip out of daily life. Think about it. A sealed tomb doesn't offend anyone. It doesn't provoke outrage. It doesn't give people something obvious to mourn around. It just sits there, inaccessible, increasingly irrelevant as generations pass. No guards needed. Time does the job for free. This method also conveniently avoided religious backlash. Cleopatra had carefully aligned herself with Egyptian tradition and divine symbolism. Destroying her tomb outright could be interpreted as an insult to local beliefs. Rome preferred not to anger an already conquered population if it could avoid it. So instead of breaking sacred space, it neutralized it. And here's where the humor creeps in. Rome essentially ghosted Cleopatra. No messages, no mentions, no acknowledgement, just historical silence. Ancient writers mention the tomb briefly, then stop. Later, historians copy earlier texts, notice the gap, and shrug. Archaeologists centuries later are left staring at maps, wondering whether the tomb is hidden, submerged, or sitting beneath something extremely inconvenient like a modern parking lot. This kind of erasure also explains why we don't have stories of looting or vandalism. Looting leaves evidence. Destruction leaves rubble. Erasure leaves confusion. And confusion is exactly what surrounds Cleopatra's tomb. The irony is that this approach may have backfired. By trying to make Cleopatra forgettable, Rome accidentally made her more fascinating. A missing monument is far more intriguing than a ruined one. A vanished tomb raises questions, and questions have a way of surviving empires. So instead of a destroyed tomb, we're left with a historical riddle. A structure that existed, mattered deeply, and then slipped sideways out of recorded memory. Cleopatra spent her life manipulating visibility, knowing when to appear and when to disappear. If Rome thought it was controlling the narrative by erasing her final resting place, it may have been unknowingly following her lead, because nothing fuels legend quite like absence. And Cleopatra, even in death, understood that perfectly. As if Rome's quiet erasure wasn't enough, Alexandria itself decided to join in and complicate things. Cleopatra's city did not go gently into history. It cracked, sank, flooded, shifted, and generally behaved like a place that did not want to be pinned down on a map. If you were trying to hide a tomb, this was the ideal urban assistant. Alexandria sat on unstable ground. Earthquakes rattled it repeatedly over the centuries, sometimes violently enough to collapse entire districts. Parts of the coastline slipped into the sea, harbours sank, palaces cracked and vanished beneath rising water. What had once been the glittering heart of Cleopatra's power slowly turned into a layered mess of ruins, sand, and seawater, which is extremely inconvenient for archaeologists, but very on-brand for ancient cities. Large sections of Cleopatra's Alexandria now lie underwater. Royal quarters, temples and harbour structures have been found submerged just off the coast. Columns rest on the seabed like tired tourists. Statues stare blankly through centuries of algae. It's less lost city and more history tripped and fell into the ocean. If Cleopatra's tomb was located near the royal district, and it almost certainly was, then there's a very real chance it didn't just vanish politically. It vanished physically, buried under collapsed buildings, covered by sediment, or resting quietly beneath the Mediterranean, watching fish go about their business with no appreciation for symbolism. And here's the frustrating part. Underwater archaeology is slow, expensive, and deeply allergic to certainty. You don't dig. You probe. You map. You squint at sonar images and argue over whether that shape is a wall, a rock, or wishful thinking. Every discovery raises 10 new questions and answers none of them confidently. Meanwhile, modern Alexandria sits directly on top of ancient Alexandria. People live there, work there, drive there, drink coffee there. You cannot simply excavate an entire modern city because you have a hunch about a missing queen. History, tragically, must coexist with zoning laws. So Cleopatra's tomb may be hidden beneath layers of catastrophe, natural and human. Not destroyed, not looted, just covered. Like a priceless object shoved into the back of a drawer during a move and forgotten for 2,000 years. Rome may have erased her memory on paper. Nature may have erased her city in stone and water. And between the two, Cleopatra's tomb slipped into the perfect hiding place. Not myth, not ruin, but geography. Which raises a sobering possibility. We may already be walking above it, or sailing over it, or parking on it. History has a sense of humour like that. At some point, historians stopped asking, "Where is Cleopatra's tomb?" and started asking a much more unsettling question. Is it underwater? Because when an ancient city keeps sliding into the sea, you eventually have to accept that gravity and water have joined the conspiracy. The underwater theory is not romantic, but it is stubbornly practical. Large portions of ancient Alexandria are already submerged. Archaeologists have found palaces, harbours, roads, and statues resting quietly beneath the waves, as if the city simply lay down for a nap and never got back up. If Cleopatra's tomb was located anywhere near the royal district, which would make sense historically, politically, and aesthetically, then the sea may have claimed it without asking permission. And here's the uncomfortable part. Water is very good at hiding things. Underwater ruins don't collapse loudly. They don't leave dramatic rubble piles. They sink, settle, and get wrapped in layers of sand, like history, tucking them in and whispering, "You'll deal with this later." A sealed tomb could remain intact for centuries beneath the seabed, protected from looters, tourists, and overly enthusiastic emperors. In other words, the ocean might be Cleopatra's most loyal bodyguard. This theory also explains why we don't have ancient stories about the tomb being looted. You can't loot what you can't reach. If earthquakes fractured the coastline and sent parts of the city sliding downward, the tomb could have disappeared within a generation. Quietly, completely, and without leaving anyone to write angry letters about it. Modern technology has helped, but only slightly. Sonar scans reveal shapes. Divers photograph ruins. Scholars argue about whether a rectangular outline is a wall, a foundation, or just a rock with good posture. Underwater archaeology is less Indiana Jones and more people in wetsuits debating geometry. And even if the tomb were found underwater, excavation would be delicate, slow, and controversial. Do you disturb a burial that has remained untouched for 2,000 years? Do you leave it where it is? Do you risk damaging it just to satisfy curiosity? These are the kinds of questions that stall discoveries for decades. There's also something strangely fitting about this idea. Cleopatra spent her life navigating shifting political tides. Being swallowed by the sea feels like a final act of poetic consistency. No conqueror reached her. No emperor claimed her remains. Just water, silence, and time. If Cleopatra wanted to vanish beyond Rome's grasp, she couldn't have chosen a better hiding place. If the sea doesn't have Cleopatra's tomb, then historians turn their attention to the gods, or more specifically, Isis. Cleopatra didn't just worship Isis in private like a normal low-profile believer. She went all in, publicly, repeatedly, strategically. Cleopatra presented herself as the living embodiment of the goddess, not in a symbolic, inspired by way, but in a very direct "I am her, please adjust accordingly" manner. This matters because in ancient Egypt, burial location was theology. Where you were laid to rest said everything about who you were, what you represented, and which cosmic role you expected to play forever. If Cleopatra saw herself as Isis in life, then aligning her tomb with an Isis sanctuary in death wasn't just logical, it was branding consistency. Which brings us to the Temple of Isis and sites associated with her worship. Several ancient writers hint that Cleopatra's tomb was near a sacred precinct rather than in a traditional royal necropolis. That's unusual, but Cleopatra was not known for doing things the standard way. She preferred meaningful gestures over expected ones. If a pharaoh wanted pyramids, she wanted symbolism. If tradition said one thing, she asked what message it sent, then rewrote it. A tomb near an Isis temple would do several things at once. It would reinforce her divine identity. It would tie her memory to a living cult rather than a static monument. And it would make her resting place spiritually significant, not just politically dangerous. Rome could ignore a tomb. It could not easily suppress a religious association without angering locals who still believed in the goddess, which again is deeply inconvenient for an empire trying to stabilize a new province. This connection also helps explain why the tomb was not loudly destroyed. You can demolish a palace. You can topple a statue. But interfering with sacred ground is a faster way to turn passive resentment into active resistance. Rome preferred quiet solutions. So instead, the location becomes vague. References blur. Later writers disagree. The temple remains. The tomb does not. Somewhere near a place of worship, perhaps intentionally hidden in plain sight, Cleopatra may have been laid to rest where politics ended and religion began, a space Rome treaded carefully around. And if that was the plan, it worked beautifully. Because 2,000 years later, we're still standing at the intersection of faith, power, and silence, asking the same question Cleopatra likely wanted us to ask. Is the tomb missing? Or simply sacred enough to stay hidden? Once the Temple of Isis connection entered the conversation, one site began quietly stealing the spotlight: Taposiris Magna. Located west of Alexandria, this ancient temple complex has become the archaeological equivalent of "don't get too excited," but also maybe. And historians hate that feeling. Taposiris Magna was dedicated to Isis and Osiris, which already makes it suspiciously on brand for Cleopatra. The site sits just far enough from Alexandria to be discreet, but close enough to remain symbolically tied to the city she ruled. If Cleopatra wanted a burial place that was sacred, meaningful, and slightly inconvenient for Roman officials to interfere with, this location checks a lot of boxes. Excavations there have uncovered some genuinely interesting things. Coins bearing Cleopatra's face, statues that resemble royal figures, underground tunnels, ritual chambers. The kind of discoveries that make archaeologists clear their throats and say phrases like "highly suggestive" and "worth further investigation," which is academic language for "we are emotionally invested, but terrified of being wrong." The tunnels are especially intriguing. Carved deep beneath the temple, they suggest deliberate planning, secrecy, and a willingness to put in extra effort, all qualities Cleopatra was known for. These aren't casual storage spaces. They feel intentional, purpose-built, as if someone wanted something important placed below, out of sight, protected by layers of stone and sanctity. And yet, no tomb, no burial chamber definitively linked to Cleopatra. No inscriptions declaring, "Yes, this is it, congratulations, please stop digging." Just more clues, more possibilities, and more reasons to argue at conferences. skeptics point out that finding Cleopatra's image at a temple of Isis isn't shocking. She put her face on everything. Coins, statues, political messaging. She was very aware of branding. Her presence alone doesn't guarantee her body followed. But supporters counter that Cleopatra was deeply strategic. If she planned her death, her burial, and her legacy as carefully as sources suggest, then choosing a site like Taposiris Magna would be exactly the kind of long game she'd play. Sacred, symbolic, and just ambiguous enough to frustrate Rome. So Taposiris Magna sits in historical limbo, not proven, not dismissed. A place full of promise and restraint. A reminder that archaeology rarely gives us cinematic endings. Sometimes it gives us almost. And almost is the most dangerous word in mystery. Because once you see the possibility, you can't stop looking for the rest. By now it's tempting to assume that Cleopatra's tomb must be hiding behind one last dramatic reveal, waiting patiently for the right archaeologist with the right hat to stumble upon it. Unfortunately, history is rarely that considerate. The far more likely explanation is also the least satisfying one. The tomb is still missing, because finding it is genuinely, deeply, logistically miserable. First, there's geography. Ancient Alexandria sits beneath modern Alexandria, which is currently full of people who would like to keep their homes, businesses, and plumbing intact. Archaeology is wonderful, but it becomes much less charming when it involves digging through apartment buildings, roads, and neighborhoods where someone is already annoyed about traffic. You can't just announce, "Sorry everyone, we're looking for a queen." Then there's the sea. If parts of the city slid underwater, excavation becomes slow, expensive, and extremely cautious. Underwater archaeology is not digging, it's negotiating. Every move risks collapse, damage, or the discovery that what looked promising is actually just a rock that happens to resemble hope. Next comes the problem of evidence. Cleopatra lived in a city built, destroyed, rebuilt, and repurposed multiple times over centuries. Temples became churches. Churches became mosques. Palaces became rubble. Rubble became foundations. Even if the tomb still exists, it may be unrecognizable without a clear inscription saying, "Yes, this is definitely the one." And let's talk about records. Roman historians were not neutral observers. They wrote with agendas, biases, and occasional spite. Egyptian records from this period are fragmented at best. Over time, references to the tomb grow vague, then vanish entirely. When both sides stop being helpful, archaeology is left guessing. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that the tomb was intentionally concealed so well that it did its job. Cleopatra understood power, symbolism, and long games. If she wanted to deny Rome closure, denying future historians convenience would be an acceptable side effect. And finally, there's chance. Floods, fires, collapses, looting that left no trace worth recording. Sometimes history doesn't preserve the things we want most. It preserves what survives accidents. So the tomb remains missing not because historians aren't looking, but because everything is working against them. Geography, politics, time, water, bureaucracy, and the queen herself. If Cleopatra wanted to be remembered without being pinned down, she succeeded brilliantly. The mystery persists, not due to ignorance, but because the ancient world was very good at hiding what mattered. At some point in every historical mystery, we have to ask the question everyone hopes isn't the answer. What if the tomb was found a long time ago and quietly emptied? It's not glamorous. It's not cinematic. There's no dramatic torchlight discovery or shocked archaeologist whispering, "My God." But it is, unfortunately, very human. Ancient tombs were robbed constantly. Not centuries later, sometimes weeks after burial. Grave robbing wasn't a fringe activity. It was a profession. A risky one, sure. But when a tomb was rumoured to contain gold, jewellery, ritual objects and royal treasures, moral objections tended to take the day off. If Cleopatra's tomb was located somewhere accessible, even briefly, it would have been irresistible. Not just because of wealth, but because of prestige. Looting the tomb of the last pharaoh of Egypt would have been the ultimate career move for an ancient criminal. Resume: robbed Cleopatra, retired immediately. And here's the problem. Successful looting leaves very little behind. Gold is melted down. Precious stones are reused. Coffins are stripped. Inscriptions are damaged or removed. What remains is often an empty space, a chamber that looks disappointingly ordinary once the valuable context is gone. Without clear markings, such a tomb becomes indistinguishable from dozens of others. Even worse, looting often happened quietly. No dramatic records, no official complaints, just absence. And absence, as we've learned, is Cleopatra's specialty. There's also the Roman angle. If Roman authorities learned of the tomb's location, they may have sanctioned or tolerated its stripping. Not out of greed, though that wouldn't hurt, but because removing the wealth removed the symbol. A looted tomb cannot become a shrine. It cannot inspire reverence. It becomes just another empty hole in the ground. The irony is brutal. If the tomb was looted early, then it may technically have been found, just not documented in a way modern historians would appreciate. No photos, no notes, no plaques. Just a brief moment where Cleopatra's final resting place intersected with human opportunism, and then vanished again. This theory doesn't feel satisfying. It feels anticlimactic. But history is full of anticlimactic endings disguised as mystery. And if Cleopatra's tomb was stripped and forgotten, that doesn't erase her story. It reinforces it. Even in death, people tried to take from her. And even then, she slipped out of reach, leaving behind nothing but questions, which at this point feels very on brand. At this point, you might reasonably ask, why does it matter? Cleopatra is already famous. Her face is everywhere. Her story is told in books, films, and arguments that begin with "actually." Finding her tomb won't change the fact that she existed, ruled, and annoyed Rome profoundly. So why does the missing tomb still bother historians so much? Because tombs tell the truth stories avoid. Almost everything we know about Cleopatra comes filtered through Roman writers, men who had every reason to dislike her, fear her, and exaggerate her flaws for sport. They painted her as manipulative, dangerous, exotic, and morally suspicious. In short, they did what empires often do when confronted with a powerful woman they couldn't control. A tomb would bypass all of that. Burial choices reveal how a person wanted to be remembered. The symbols they chose, the gods they aligned with, the language they used for eternity instead of propaganda. Cleopatra's tomb would tell us whether she saw herself primarily as an Egyptian pharaoh, a Hellenistic queen, a goddess, or something more complicated, which, given her personality, is the safest bet. It would also remind us that Cleopatra was not just a love interest in a Roman tragedy. She was a ruler with political goals, administrative skill, and a vision for Egypt that didn't include becoming a Roman province. Her tomb would anchor her story in her own culture rather than Rome's commentary section. And yes, there's also the human element. Cleopatra was not a myth while she was alive. She had a body, a voice, a physical presence that history later turned into legend. Finding her tomb would restore that humanity. It would remind us that even the most iconic figures eventually become very quiet and very still. There's also something deeply unsettling about unresolved endings. We like conclusions. We like closure. Cleopatra's missing tomb denies us both. It leaves her story open-ended, which is frustrating, but also fitting. Because Cleopatra spent her life resisting being neatly categorized. Rome wanted her defeated. History wanted her simplified. She refused both. So the search for her tomb isn't just about archaeology. It's about reclaiming a voice that was overwritten. It's about asking what Cleopatra wanted to say after death, not what her enemies said about her. And until that tomb is found, the argument continues. After centuries of searching, theorizing, excavating, diving, and politely arguing at conferences, an uncomfortable thought begins to creep in. One historians don't like to say out loud because it sounds suspiciously like giving up. What if the mystery is the ending? We tend to assume that every important figure must leave behind a neatly labelled resting place, preferably with signage and a gift shop. But Cleopatra's entire life was defined by refusing neat endings. She ruled between cultures, between empires, between identities. She was never fully Roman, never fully Greek, never just Egyptian. She existed in the margins, and she was powerful there. A missing tomb fits that pattern uncomfortably well. Think about what a discovered tomb would do. It would finalize her story, lock it in, turn her into an artifact, a solved problem, a chapter that can be closed. And Cleopatra was never interested in being closed. A hidden or lost tomb keeps her untouchable. Rome never paraded her remains. No conqueror stood over her grave. No emperor claimed her bones as proof of victory. She denied them that satisfaction, and maybe denied history its certainty as well. There's also a quieter kind of power in absence. A visible monument invites interpretation, vandalism, appropriation. A missing one invites speculation, debate, curiosity. It keeps her alive in conversation rather than locked behind museum glass. And let's be honest, Cleopatra understood how memory works better than most modern public figures. She knew that people obsess over what they can't have. That mystery outlives marble. That silence can be louder than inscriptions. So maybe the tomb was hidden intentionally, or placed somewhere meant to be lost, or designed to vanish as the city changed. Maybe Cleopatra accepted that her physical body didn't matter as much as the story surrounding it, a story that Rome could not fully control. There's a kind of poetic defiance in that. Rome conquered Egypt. Rome rewrote history. Rome controlled monuments. But Rome never got the body. And that denial may be Cleopatra's final victory. A refusal to let even death be claimed, catalogued, or conquered. The mystery frustrates us because we want answers. Cleopatra frustrates us because she never gave them freely. And perhaps, after everything, that's exactly the point. Cleopatra remains one of the few figures in history who managed to escape even death's paperwork. Kings have graves, emperors have mausoleums, minor officials have modest markers that at least say, "I existed." Cleopatra has vibes, references, arguments, and a complete lack of GPS coordinates. And that absence does something interesting. It forces us to confront how much of history is built on what survives, rather than what mattered. Cleopatra mattered immensely, politically, culturally, symbolically. Yet her physical presence has vanished, while lesser figures rest comfortably in labelled stone boxes, complete with museum plaques and audio guides. There's something quietly subversive about that. A tomb would anchor her, freeze her in one place. Allow scholars to say, this is where the story ends. But Cleopatra's story has never stayed put. It slips between Rome and Egypt, myth and reality, propaganda and personality. A fixed grave would simplify her, and Cleopatra resisted simplification like it was a personal insult. Instead, she lingers as a question. Was the tomb hidden, erased, lost to the sea, looted and forgotten? Every theory tells us more about the people asking the question than about the answer itself. Some want romance, some want conspiracy, some want closure. Cleopatra offers none of it. She leaves us standing in uncertainty, which history is deeply uncomfortable with. And yet, this might be the most honest ending possible. Cleopatra was a ruler who lived between worlds, between empires, between cultures, between identities. A queen who understood that power wasn't just territory, but perception. That memory could be shaped. That absence could speak. Her missing tomb denies Rome its final triumph. It denies historians their neat conclusion. It denies us the satisfaction of pointing to a spot on a map and saying, "There, that's where she ended." Instead, Cleopatra remains everywhere, in texts, in art, in debate, and nowhere in stone. A queen without coordinates. a ruler without a grave, a presence that refuses to settle. And maybe that's the final lesson buried inside the mystery. Some people don't belong to places, they belong to questions. Cleopatra understood that. And 2,000 years later, she's still making us look for her, on her terms. Long cattle drives didn't come with menus, reservations, or the option to just skip dinner. Once a herd started moving, it moved for months across hundreds of miles of dust, heat, rain, and animals that absolutely did not care about your hunger. Feeding dozens of men under those conditions required something tougher than good intentions. It required a system, and that system came in the form of the Chuckwagon, a boxy, rattling miracle of survival engineering. Before the Chuckwagon, cowboys mostly improvised. Food was packed in sacks, cooked when possible, and eaten when luck allowed. Meals were irregular, supplies spoiled quickly, and morale dropped fast when bellies stayed empty. Cattle barons learned this the hard way. Hungry men made careless mistakes, and careless mistakes meant lost cattle, injured riders, or worse. So around the mid-19th century, someone finally connected the dots. If the trail was mobile, the kitchen needed to be mobile too. The classic Chuckwagon was built from a reinforced wagon bed with a hinged rear panel that folded down into a work surface. Inside were drawers, shelves, hooks, and compartments designed to hold everything from flour sacks to tin plates. Barrels of water were strapped to the sides. A canvas cover protected supplies from rain and sun, though protected is doing some generous work here. Dust still got everywhere. It always did. At the heart of this operation stood the cook. Not a glamorous job, but easily one of the most powerful positions on the trail. The cook decided when meals happened, what was eaten, and how long everyone waited. A bad cook could ruin morale faster than a stampede. A good one became quietly untouchable. Cowboys might fight, curse, and complain, but nobody messed with the person holding the skillet. The Chuckwagon didn't just carry food, it carried order. Breakfast, dinner, and supper followed the wagon's rhythm, giving structure to days that otherwise blurred into endless riding. When the wagon stopped, the drive paused. When the fire was lit, the day had meaning again. In a landscape with few landmarks and no comforts, that mattered more than anyone admitted. So the Chuckwagon wasn't just a kitchen on wheels, it was the spine of the cattle drive. Take it away, and the entire operation collapsed into chaos, hunger, and very bad decisions made on empty stomachs. If you opened a Chuckwagon expecting variety, you were about to be emotionally humbled. Space was limited, weight mattered, and anything fragile, fancy, or prone to spoiling was immediately disqualified. What survived the cut were foods that could endure heat, rain, insects, rough handling, and weeks of neglect, which explains why the menu looked the way it did. At the center of everything were beans, dried beans, soaked overnight if the cook remembered, boiled endlessly if he didn't. They were cheap, filling, and nearly immortal. Beans showed up for breakfast, dinner, and supper, sometimes in different pots, sometimes suspiciously in the same one. Cowboys joked about them, complained about them, and kept eating them anyway because hunger has a way of silencing criticism. Next came flour. Not for elegance, but for survival. Flour became biscuits, dumplings, and anything that could be baked quickly in a Dutch oven. Sourdough starters were guarded like family heirlooms. Lose the starter, and you lost bread, which meant morale dropped and tempers rose. A good biscuit wasn't light or fluffy. It was solid, dependable, and capable of being eaten one-handed while sitting on the ground, which was the highest praise possible. Meat, when available, was usually salt pork or bacon packed in brine. Fresh beef happened only when a cow was injured or culled from the herd. Otherwise, meat was greasy, salty, and cooked hard enough to survive a second lifetime. The goal wasn't tenderness. The goal was not getting sick. Coffee was non-negotiable. It was brewed thick, bitter, and strong enough to wake the dead, or at least the deeply resentful. Grounds were reused until they surrendered completely. Sugar might be added if supplies allowed, but most men drank it black because there was work to do, and complaining burned calories. Other supplies rounded out the wagon: dried apples, rice, molasses, baking soda, lard, and sometimes canned goods if the drive was well funded. There were no spices to speak of. Salt was king. Pepper was a luxury. Garlic was a rumour. Everything inside the wagon had one job: keep men moving forward. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about fuel. And as monotonous as it was, that food turned dust, exhaustion, and muscle into miles. Without it, the trail ended very quickly. Chuckwagon cooking was not culinary art. It was controlled chaos performed with fire, iron, and a level of patience that bordered on resignation. There were no precise measurements, no timers, and absolutely no room for mistakes. Everything happened outdoors, exposed to wind, rain, sudden cold snaps, and the occasional curious animal that clearly did not understand boundaries. The fire was the foundation of the entire operation. Built from whatever wood could be scavenged along the trail, it was rarely ideal. Sometimes it burned too hot, sometimes barely at all. The cook learned to read flames the way sailors read weather. Too much heat scorched biscuits into geological samples. Too little left beans stubbornly crunchy and deeply offensive to morale. There was no walking away from the fire. If it failed, the meal failed. Iron cookware did the heavy lifting. Dutch ovens, skillets, and coffee pots were thick, blackened, and indestructible. They were passed down, repaired, and protected like tools of war. A cracked pot was a disaster. A lost skillet was grounds for serious anger. Iron held heat well and forgave abuse, but it demanded respect. Burn something once, and the smell followed you for days. Cooking usually began before dawn. Breakfast had to be ready before the herd moved, which meant the cook was awake long before anyone else. Biscuits were mixed half asleep, coffee brewed in silence, beans reheated from the previous night because nothing went to waste. Lunch was often cold: bread, dried meat, maybe leftover beans, eaten quickly on the trail. Supper was the main event, the one meal where men actually sat down, even if sitting meant squatting near the fire. Cleanliness was relative. Water was precious, so dishes were wiped, rinsed quickly, and reused. Grease stayed. Flavors merged. By the end of a drive, every pot tasted faintly of everything it had ever held. No one complained. Complaints did not make the food cleaner. What made Chuckwagon cooking remarkable wasn't the taste. It was the consistency. Meals appeared every day under impossible conditions. Fire was coaxed into cooperation. Iron did its job. And somehow, despite dust, exhaustion, and limited supplies, the cook fed everyone again. On the trail, that was nothing short of a daily miracle. On a cattle drive, rank technically mattered. Trail boss, wranglers, hands, everyone had a place. But in reality, there was one person no one challenged: the cook. He didn't outrank anyone on paper, yet he controlled the most important resource on the trail: food. And food meant survival, morale, and the thin line between cooperation and open hostility. The cook rose before everyone else and went to sleep after everyone else. His day started in the dark, coaxing a fire to life while the rest of the camp still lay wrapped in blankets and complaints. By the time cowboys rolled out of bed, coffee was already steaming, and biscuits were somewhere between edible and dangerous. If breakfast was late, the cook heard about it. If it was bad, he heard about it more quietly, because insulting the cook was a risky long-term strategy. This was not a job for someone delicate. The cook worked alone, often in miserable weather, with constant pressure and zero appreciation. He had to track supplies, stretch ingredients, and anticipate how long the drive would last without resupply. Run out of flour too early and morale cratered. Waste food, and the entire drive paid for it weeks later. Despite the workload, the cook had authority. Cowboys cleaned their own mess kits, but they didn't argue about portions. The cook decided how much you got and when. He also decided who ate first, usually the night guards, because they had already worked while everyone else slept. That small gesture earned loyalty fast. Good cooks became legends. Men would sign on to drives specifically because they knew who was cooking. A competent cook could keep tempers low, energy high, and arguments short. A bad cook did the opposite. Trails with poor food saw more fights, more mistakes, and more men quitting early if they could. The cook also carried the medicine chest. If someone got sick, burned, or cut, it was the cook who handed out whatever passed for treatment. That made him part chef, part quartermaster, part reluctant healer. Again, no one messed with him. By the end of a drive, the cook was exhausted, filthy, and rarely thanked. But every man knew the truth. Without him, the Chuckwagon was just a box, and the trail was just a long, hungry mistake waiting to happen. By the 5th or 6th day on the trail, every cowboy reached the same quiet realization. This was it. The menu was not evolving. There was no surprise coming. What you ate yesterday was what you were eating today, and what you ate today would return tomorrow with the same confidence and slightly deeper flavor. Beans were no longer a side dish. They were a lifestyle. Beans earned their dominance honestly. They were cheap, light to transport, impossible to spoil, and filling enough to keep a man in the saddle all day. When soaked overnight and cooked properly, they were even pleasant. When cooked poorly, they were still eaten. Hunger erased standards quickly. On the trail, you didn't ask whether beans tasted good. You asked whether there were enough of them. Biscuits followed closely behind. Made from flour, lard, salt, and whatever mood the cook happened to be in, they ranged from soft and comforting to aggressively dense. A good biscuit was warm, filling, and capable of absorbing grease, gravy, or coffee. A bad biscuit could be used as a weapon, or traded as emergency livestock feed. Both were eaten without hesitation. Meat was the rare treat. Salt pork and bacon appeared when supplies allowed, usually fried hard and served in small portions. Fresh beef meant something had gone wrong with the herd, but no one mourned too deeply at the dinner fire. That meat was cooked fast and shared carefully. Everyone noticed who got the bigger piece, and everyone remembered. Coffee anchored every meal. It wasn't refined, it wasn't subtle. It was boiled until it surrendered. Cups were refilled constantly, especially at night, when guards rotated shifts and needed something to keep their eyes open and their tempers under control. The coffee didn't taste good, but it worked. That was enough. Occasionally, the cook might break the monotony with dried fruit, rice, or a crude stew. These moments felt almost festive. Conversations got louder. Complaints paused. For a brief moment, the trail felt less endless. But monotony was part of the system. Predictable food meant predictable energy. The Chuckwagon wasn't there to delight. It was there to endure. And every bowl of beans, every biscuit, every bitter cup of coffee pushed the herd a little farther down the trail, one repetitive meal at a time. If beans kept a cowboy alive, coffee kept him functional. On the trail, coffee wasn't a beverage. It was a requirement. The day did not begin until it was poured, and the night did not end until the pot was empty or the fire went out. Everything else on the Chuckwagon menu was negotiable. Coffee was not. Trail coffee was brewed with ruthless efficiency. Grounds were dumped straight into boiling water, stirred once if the cook was feeling generous, and then left to settle on their own. No filters, no measurements, and no concern for bitterness. If the spoon stood upright in the pot, the coffee was considered acceptable. If it didn't, more grounds were added until it behaved properly. The same grounds were often reused. Water was precious, and supplies had to last. By the end of a drive, those grounds had been boiled, reboiled, and boiled again until they surrendered everything they had ever known. The result was harsh, smoky, and deeply unforgiving. Cowboys drank it anyway. Complaining about coffee was like complaining about gravity, pointless and vaguely suspicious. Coffee served multiple purposes. It warmed men in cold mornings, sharpened them before long days in the saddle, and kept night guards awake while the herd slept. During bad weather, a hot cup was sometimes the only comfort available. It didn't fix the rain, the cold, or the exhaustion, but it made them tolerable for a few minutes. Cups were simple tin, blackened by smoke and dented from use. No one owned a clean one by the end of the trail. Coffee was poured, gulped, refilled, and passed around without ceremony. It was common to see men standing in silence around the fire at dawn, hands wrapped around cups, staring into nothing while waiting for the caffeine to take effect. Sugar and milk were luxuries, rarely present and quickly rationed. Most men drank coffee black, not out of toughness, but because that was how it came. Over time, they stopped noticing the taste. What mattered was the heat and the jolt. In many ways, coffee held the trail together. It marked time. It signaled the start of work and the end of rest. When the coffee pot was on the fire, life continued. When it wasn't, something had gone very wrong. Not every meal on the trail was calm, timely, or eaten sitting down. Cattle drives moved according to weather, terrain, and the unpredictable mood of thousands of animals. That meant the chuckwagon had to adapt constantly. Feeding men under pressure became a skill as important as cooking itself. Stampedes were the worst-case scenario. When cattle bolted in the night, everything stopped. Men rode hard for hours, sometimes until dawn, chasing noise, dust, and panic. When it was over, no one cared about presentation. They cared about calories. The cook responded by reheating whatever was available as fast as possible. Beans were ladled out without ceremony. Biscuits were handed over still warm or already cold. Coffee was poured aggressively. Bad weather created its own problems. Rain turned fires into battles. Wind scattered heat. Snow made everything slow and miserable. The cook learned to shield flames with wagon panels, bodies, or whatever else was available. Sometimes meals were delayed. Sometimes they were simplified. No one expected variety during a storm. They expected something hot. Crossing rivers was another challenge. Wagons had to be sealed, loads balanced, and fires extinguished. If supplies got wet, they had to be dried quickly or written off. Flour soaked with river water became useless. Coffee survived almost anything. Beans always survived. Timing mattered. Breakfast had to be early. Supper had to wait until the herd was settled. Lunch, when it happened at all, was often cold and eaten in shifts. Men learned to eat fast. Food disappeared the moment it was served. Seconds were rare. Hesitation meant hunger. Despite the chaos, the chuckwagon maintained order. Even during long pushes, the cook tried to keep routines intact. Regular meals anchored days that otherwise blurred together. That predictability mattered when exhaustion set in and tempers frayed. Feeding under pressure wasn't about comfort. It was about keeping men functional. A hot meal after a hard ride could reset morale almost instantly. Complaints faded, jokes returned, shoulders relaxed. The chuckwagon didn't stop stampedes. It didn't calm storms or shorten distances, but it ensured that after the worst moments on the trail, there was still food waiting. And that was often enough to keep everyone moving forward. After the meal ended, the work did not. Cleanup on the trail was a careful balance between necessity and reality. Water was limited, soap was minimal, and the idea of spotless cookware was laughable. Yet sickness could destroy a drive faster than hunger, so a rough system of cleanliness had to exist, even if it looked questionable by modern standards. Dishes were usually tin plates and cups, chosen because they could survive drops, heat, and neglect. After eating, men scraped leftovers thoroughly. Nothing edible was wasted. Grease, crumbs, and bits of biscuit were wiped away with rags or fingers. A quick rinse followed if water allowed. If it didn't, wiping had to be enough. Complaints were brief and ineffective. Pots and pans were treated with more care. Iron cookware was wiped clean, sometimes rinsed, then dried quickly over the fire to prevent rust. Soap was rarely used, partly because it was scarce and partly because it stripped away seasoning that helped food release and flavor improve. Over time, every pot developed a taste that no one could fully explain and no one tried to remove. Waste management was simple and direct. Food scraps were buried or burned. Grease was saved when possible, reused when necessary, and discarded only when it turned offensive even by trail standards. Latrines were dug away from camp and moved regularly. It wasn't elegant, but it reduced disease and kept animals from wandering too close. Sickness still happened. Dysentery, food poisoning, and stomach trouble were common, especially when water sources were questionable. When someone fell ill, the cook adjusted portions, brewed lighter coffee, and tried to stretch supplies until the man recovered or rode on regardless. The goal wasn't hygiene, it was survival. The system worked well enough to keep most men healthy most of the time. That was considered success. By the end of a drive, everything smelled like smoke, grease, and trail dust. Cleanliness was theoretical. But the Chuckwagon endured, and so did the men it fed. Eventually, every cattle drive reached its destination. Railheads appeared, towns emerged from the dust. The long rhythm of riding, eating, sleeping, and repeating finally broke. For the cowboys, this meant pay, rest, and food that came from somewhere other than a blackened pot. For the Chuckwagon, it meant something quieter, but just as important, proof that it had done its job. By the time a drive ended, the wagon was battered. Wood was scarred, wheels worn thin, canvas torn and patched repeatedly. Inside, supplies were low, and everything smelled permanently of smoke and grease. But it had carried a crew across hundreds of miles and fed them every single day. That alone made it a success. When the herd was delivered, the Chuckwagon didn't retire. It was cleaned as well as possible, repaired where needed, and restocked for the next drive. Some wagons served for years, rolling from one trail to the next, becoming familiar landmarks to anyone who worked cattle long enough. Cooks came and went, but the wagons stayed. The influence of Chuckwagon cooking didn't end with the cattle drives. The methods, recipes, and habits followed cowboys into ranch kitchens, logging camps, and frontier towns. Beans, biscuits, and strong coffee became cultural staples, not because they were romantic, but because they worked. Chuckwagon cooking shaped what people expected food to be: filling, simple, and reliable. Even as railroads shortened drives and modern kitchens replaced open fires, the image of the Chuckwagon stuck around. It represented self-sufficiency, order in chaos, and the idea that no matter how rough the day had been, there would be something hot waiting at night. That idea mattered. Looking back, Chuckwagon cooking wasn't about flavor or innovation. It was about logistics, discipline, and endurance. Feeding dozens of exhausted men under brutal conditions required planning, toughness, and repetition. The food didn't change much, because it didn't need to. When the trail ended, the Chuckwagon rolled on into memory, not as a symbol of luxury, but as one of the most practical inventions of the American frontier. It kept people moving, alive, and just content enough to keep going. And on the trail, that was everything. Edo Japan is often described as an age of peace, and technically that description is correct. Battles ended, castles stopped burning, and roads filled with merchants instead of marching armies. But this calm was not the result of trust. It was the result of constant watching. The Tokugawa regime understood something uncomfortable and very practical. Peace only survives when everyone believes they are being observed. After generations of civil war, the new order feared one thing above all else: instability returning quietly. Rebellions rarely announced themselves. They grew slowly, fed by resentment, ambition, or nostalgia for the old chaos. So instead of relying on armies alone, the shogunate built an information state, not loud, not theatrical, subtle, bureaucratic, and relentless. Every domain was watched. Daimyo were allowed to rule their lands, but only under strict conditions. They were required to spend alternating years in Edo, leaving their families behind as a form of polite hostage-taking. This system wasn't just political theatre. It generated information: who arrived late, who spent too much, who travelled unusually often. Patterns mattered. Commoners were watched too, just more quietly. Villages were organized into mutual responsibility groups. If one person caused trouble, everyone paid for it. That turned neighbors into observers and gossip into a form of surveillance. You didn't need secret police when everyone was incentivized to report irregular behavior before it became dangerous. Travel was tightly controlled. Roads were monitored. Checkpoints recorded names, destinations, and reasons for movement. Anyone traveling without proper papers stood out immediately. In a society where movement itself required permission, secrecy became expensive and risky. Even temples and inns played a role. Lodging records were kept. Guests were remembered. Unfamiliar faces were noted. Information didn't always move upward formally, but it moved sideways constantly. Rumors traveled faster than official reports, and authorities knew how to listen. What makes Edo espionage fascinating is how ordinary it looked. There were no dramatic disguises or cinematic betrayals, just forms, routines, and people quietly paying attention. Peace was not maintained by ignoring threats, but by assuming they existed everywhere. In Edo Japan, stability wasn't built on trust. It was built on the understanding that someone, somewhere, was always watching, and that acting out of line would never go unnoticed for long. Edo Japan did not rely on dramatic spies slipping through shadows. Its most effective intelligence network wore ordinary faces and lived ordinary lives. Shopkeepers, innkeepers, temple attendants, porters, and village elders formed the backbone of surveillance. Not because they were trained agents, but because they were perfectly positioned to notice change. The shogunate understood that information flows naturally where people gather. Inns saw travelers arrive tired, careless, and talkative. Tea houses heard rumors before officials did. Market stalls caught whispers about shortages, strange visitors, or sudden wealth. None of these people carried official titles as spies, but many were expected to report anything unusual. Some did it for payment, others did it out of fear. Many did it simply because that was how order was maintained. Village headmen were especially important. They were responsible for tax collection, population registers, and local behavior. If someone disappeared, arrived unexpectedly, or behaved suspiciously, the headman noticed. More importantly, he was held accountable if he didn't. This created a system where ignoring trouble was more dangerous than reporting it. Temples also played a quiet role. Religious institutions registered households, recorded births and deaths, and confirmed identities. This wasn't spiritual oversight. It was administrative surveillance disguised as routine religious duty. If someone claimed to be from another region, records could confirm or contradict the story quickly. Informants were rarely rewarded with praise. Their compensation was safety. Cooperation kept suspicion away. Silence invited scrutiny. In a society built on hierarchy and obligation, staying invisible meant aligning with authority, not resisting it. What made this system effective was how unremarkable it felt. There was no clear moment where someone crossed a line into espionage. Reporting was folded into everyday responsibility. Gossip became intelligence. Observation became civic duty. This blurred boundary created a culture of caution. People learned to speak carefully, travel honestly, and avoid unnecessary attention. Secrets were not impossible to keep, but they were difficult to move. Every step, every conversation, passed through a landscape full of listening ears. Edo espionage thrived not because people were paranoid, but because they were practical. Stability depended on awareness, and awareness depended on everyone watching just enough to keep the peace intact. In Edo Japan, moving from one place to another was not a casual decision. Travel itself was treated as a potential threat. Roads connected people, ideas, and ambitions, and the shogunate understood that uncontrolled movement had fueled rebellion in the past, so they turned mobility into paperwork. Anyone traveling long distances needed a permit. These documents listed names, origins, destinations, and reasons for travel. They weren't suggestions. They were checked constantly at road barriers, river crossings, and city gates. A missing or inconsistent permit didn't just delay you. It invited questioning, detention, or worse. Checkpoints were everywhere. The most famous sat along major highways leading to Edo, but smaller ones existed throughout the countryside. Guards examined papers carefully, comparing descriptions to faces and noting details like accent, clothing, and companions. A traveller who looked wrong was treated as wrong until proven otherwise. The system was especially strict about two things: weapons and women. Weapons were monitored to prevent armed uprisings. Women were monitored to prevent daimyo families from fleeing Edo. Officially, it was about safety. In practice, it was about control. A woman travelling without proper documentation triggered immediate suspicion. Permits also created records. Names and movements were logged. Patterns emerged. Someone travelling too often raised eyebrows. Someone travelling to unusual destinations attracted attention. Information didn't need to be dramatic to be useful. Consistency was expected. Deviations mattered. This made covert movement extremely difficult. Espionage required blending in perfectly or not moving at all. Disguises failed under scrutiny. False stories unravelled when checked against temple records or village registers. The road itself became an extension of the intelligence network. Even merchants felt the pressure. Trade was encouraged, but monitored. Goods were inspected. Routes were predictable. An unfamiliar trader asking the wrong questions could quickly find himself reported by people who had nothing to gain from secrecy. The result was a society where space was visible. The shogunate didn't need to chase threats across the country. Threats had to pass through gates, checkpoints, and forms. Movement left fingerprints. In Edo Japan, espionage was not about speed, it was about patience. And the most effective defense wasn't walls or armies. It was the simple act of making every step traceable. Espionage in Edo Japan rarely looked like espionage. There were no cloaks, no secret handshakes, no dramatic nighttime exchanges. Surveillance worked precisely because it blended into daily life so completely that most people stopped noticing it. Watching wasn't an act. It was a habit. Cities were designed to be observable. Streets were narrow, neighbourhoods tightly packed, and movement predictable. People lived, worked, and socialised in the same areas for years. That meant anyone new stood out immediately. A stranger asking questions didn't need to be followed. Someone else would notice and remember. Neighbourhood associations played a key role. Groups of households were bound together in mutual responsibility. If one person committed a crime or caused unrest, everyone suffered consequences. This arrangement turned neighbours into monitors. You didn't need loyalty to the state. You just needed to protect yourself. Shops and workplaces functioned the same way. Apprentices were watched by masters. Workers were watched by foremen. Behaviour outside expectations drew attention quickly, not because people were cruel, but because disorder threatened everyone's stability. Quiet conformity was safer than curiosity. Even architecture helped. Inns recorded guests. Baths separated locals from outsiders. Tea houses recognised regulars instantly. These places weren't intelligence offices, but they produced intelligence naturally. An unfamiliar face asking about politics, samurai movements, or domain affairs became memorable fast. Samurai themselves were under observation. Despite their status, they were not trusted blindly. A ronin without a master was especially suspect. Too many unemployed warriors had once turned rebellion into an occupation. Now they were watched closely, questioned often, and discouraged from gathering in large numbers. What's striking is how little force this required. Surveillance didn't rely on fear alone. It relied on routine. People learned what was normal and what wasn't. Once that baseline existed, anything unusual triggered reaction automatically. This system created a strange kind of calm. Most people followed rules not because they loved them, but because breaking them was exhausting. Every deviation attracted attention. Every secret required effort. In Edo Japan, surveillance didn't hide in the shadows. It stood in plain sight, woven into the rhythm of daily life. and because it felt ordinary, it was incredibly effective. In a society where conversation was monitored and movement recorded, secrecy had to become subtle. Edo Japan didn't rely on dramatic ciphers or hidden ink. Instead, it developed a quiet language of implication, gesture, and omission. The safest messages were the ones that didn't look like messages at all. Much of this came down to phrasing. People learned how to speak indirectly, especially about politics or authority. Opinions were wrapped in proverbs, jokes, or references to the past. A complaint about taxes might be framed as a story about a greedy landlord from a century earlier. Everyone understood the meaning. Nothing incriminating was said aloud. Written communication followed similar rules. Letters were polite, vague, and often deliberately boring. Sensitive information was implied through timing, repetition, or what was not mentioned. A sudden change in tone or an unusual greeting could signal concern. Silence itself could be a warning. Merchants used codes built into trade language. Prices, quantities, or delivery dates could signal risk or opportunity. A shipment delayed for weather might mean inspection trouble. A product described as unavailable might indicate political tension in a region. These weren't secret codes in the formal sense. They were shared habits that only insiders recognized. Visual signals mattered too. Clothing, accessories, and even grooming carried meaning. A samurai wearing slightly altered colors might signal affiliation. A shop rearranging its entrance might indicate caution. Small changes stood out precisely because everything else was so regulated. Religious spaces offered limited cover. Pilgrimages allowed travel, but were closely watched. Even so, rituals and prayers could communicate alignment or dissent without words. Symbolism did the work language could not. What made these systems effective was deniability. Nothing was explicit enough to punish easily. Authorities knew messages were being passed, but proving intent was difficult without overt action. That ambiguity protected both sender and receiver, as long as they remained disciplined. Espionage in Edo Japan wasn't about cracking codes. It was about reading context. Knowing what normal looked like made deviations meaningful. The message wasn't hidden. It was camouflaged by culture itself. In a world where every word could be overheard, the safest secrets were the ones spoken softly, indirectly, or not at all. For all the surveillance aimed at commoners, the people watched most closely were the powerful. Daimyo ruled their domains with near absolute authority, commanded armies, and controlled wealth. From the shogunate's perspective, this made them the greatest potential threat. Espionage in Edo Japan existed largely to answer one question. Which lord might one day stop cooperating? The answer was sought constantly, and rarely directly. Daimyo were never accused outright unless evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they were observed through routine. Attendance at court, spending habits, marriage alliances, the size and behavior of their retinues. Loyalty was measured less by words than by patterns. The alternate residence system forced daimyo to live part-time in Edo, surrounded by rivals, officials, and watchers. Their homes became open books. How lavishly they entertained, whom they met, how often messengers arrived from their home domain. Even silence was noted. A lord who stopped communicating regularly raised suspicion. Their families played an unspoken role. Wives and heirs remained in Edo while the daimyo returned home. Officially, this was a sign of trust. In reality, it ensured good behavior. Rebellion would not just fail. It would cost everything a lord cared about. Within domains, inspectors quietly gathered information. Tax records, harvest reports, and infrastructure projects all revealed intent. Building roads could mean prosperity. It could also mean military preparation. Repairing castles might be maintenance or ambition. The difference mattered. Even generosity was watched. A daimyo who gave too much to retainers risked appearing ambitious. One who gave too little risked unrest. Balance was survival. Loyalty had to be visible but never excessive. Power had to be exercised carefully, like a blade kept sharp but sheathed. Espionage here wasn't dramatic, it was patient. Decades could pass without incident, yet records grew thicker. When a domain finally acted out of line, authorities already knew where to look. Information didn't prevent rebellion by force, it prevented surprise. In Edo Japan, the most dangerous person wasn't the loud rebel. It was the quiet lord whose actions didn't quite align. And everyone in power knew they were being measured, constantly, against an invisible standard they could never see, only guess at. While Edo Japan focused intensely on internal stability, it never lost sight of an external danger it barely understood and deeply distrusted. Foreign influence had helped destabilize earlier regimes, and the Tokugawa leadership was determined not to repeat that mistake. Espionage wasn't just about watching Japanese subjects. It was about making sure foreign eyes stayed blind. Officially, Japan was closed. In reality, it was selectively sealed. Limited trade continued through tightly controlled points, most famously at Nagasaki. Foreigners were confined, monitored, and documented obsessively. Their movements were restricted, their contacts recorded. Even their interpreters were watched carefully because language itself was a potential weapon. Information flowed both ways, and that worried authorities. Foreign merchants brought goods, but also ideas. Religion, technology, political concepts, all of it was treated as potentially corrosive. Espionage focused on identifying who listened too closely, asked too many questions, or showed excessive curiosity about the outside world. Japanese who interacted with foreigners became automatic suspects. Translators, port officials, doctors, and traders lived under constant scrutiny. A private conversation could be reported. A misplaced gift could raise suspicion. Curiosity itself became dangerous. Christianity, in particular, terrified the regime. It represented loyalty to something beyond the state. Surveillance of suspected Christians was relentless. Neighborhood groups reported unusual prayers. Temples tracked attendance. Refusal to participate in public rituals became evidence. Espionage here wasn't subtle, it was systematic. Foreign knowledge still entered Japan, but cautiously. Medical texts, maps, and scientific instruments were studied quietly by approved scholars. This wasn't openness, it was controlled curiosity. Authorities wanted the benefits without the influence. Espionage ensured the balance didn't tip. What's striking is how fear shaped intelligence priorities. The shogunate didn't believe foreigners would invade tomorrow. It feared something slower and harder to fight. Ideas spreading quietly through trusted channels. In this environment, espionage wasn't about catching spies in disguise. It was about identifying weak points in belief and loyalty. The danger wasn't an enemy army. It was a subject who stopped thinking the way the system required. Peace in Edo Japan depended not just on watching people, but on watching what they believed, and intervening long before belief turned into action. For all its layers of surveillance, Edo Japan was not perfect. Information systems don't fail loudly. They fail quietly, through assumptions, delays, and human hesitation. Espionage was designed to prevent rebellion, but it could not eliminate ambition, resentment, or desperation. When things went wrong, it was rarely because no one was watching. It was because what they saw was misunderstood or ignored. Most unrest began small. A dispute over taxes, a local famine, a disgruntled group of ronin. These were common problems, usually contained through negotiation or quiet punishment. The danger came when authorities assumed familiarity meant control. Long periods of peace bred confidence, and confidence dulled urgency. Local officials sometimes delayed reporting bad news. Admitting unrest reflected poorly on competence. A village headman might downplay tensions to protect his position. A domain official might soften reports to avoid scrutiny. Espionage depended on honesty, and honesty competed with self-preservation. When rebellion did break out, it often spread faster than expected. Networks designed to observe were not designed to respond quickly. Information moved upward through layers of bureaucracy, slowing action. By the time orders returned, damage had already been done. False positives also caused harm. Innocent people were investigated, restricted, or punished because patterns looked wrong. Suspicion hardened communities. Excessive watching could create the very resentment it sought to prevent. Authorities walked a constant line between vigilance and overreach. Even successful intelligence created problems. Knowing about dissent did not automatically solve it. Economic hardship, natural disasters, and social inequality could not be arrested or interrogated away. Surveillance identified symptoms, not cures. Yet the system adapted. Failures were studied, rules tightened, procedures refined. Each breakdown reinforced the belief that watching was still necessary, just not yet sufficient. What Edo Japan learned, slowly and repeatedly, was that peace is fragile even under constant observation. Espionage could delay collapse, manage tension, and suppress threats, but it could not eliminate change. In the end, the greatest failure of surveillance was not missing rebellion. It was believing that information alone could replace trust, reform, or flexibility. Watching kept the peace for centuries, but it could not keep it forever. By the end of the Edo period, Japan had experienced something rare in human history. Centuries of relative peace, enforced not by constant warfare, but by constant observation. Espionage had become less a profession and more an atmosphere. It shaped how people moved, spoke, and even thought, often without them consciously realizing it. The Tokugawa system did not rely on a single secret police or dramatic intelligence bureau. It worked because responsibility was distributed. Villagers watched villagers, officials watched officials, daimyo watched each other. The shogunate watched all of them, mostly by collecting patterns rather than chasing individuals. No one needed to be omniscient. They only needed enough awareness to prevent surprise. This created a society that valued predictability. Stability became a virtue. Change became suspect. Innovation happened slowly and carefully, filtered through layers of approval. For a long time, this worked. Rebellions were rare. Power transfers were orderly. Daily life felt safe, if constrained. But the cost was invisible pressure. People learned self-censorship early. Curiosity narrowed. Silence became a survival skill. Espionage didn't just stop threats. It shaped behavior, so threats were less likely to form. Peace was maintained, but it was a carefully managed peace. When the outside world finally forced itself back into Japan, the system strained. Surveillance designed for internal control struggled to adapt to foreign pressure and rapid change. The habits of watching remained, but the assumptions behind them no longer held. Looking back, espionage in Edo Japan wasn't about spies in shadows. It was about structure. Records, permits, routines, and quiet observation replaced armies and open violence. It was control without spectacle. Peace required constant watching, and for a long time, watching worked. The legacy of Edo espionage isn't secrecy. It's the reminder that stability can be engineered, but never without consequences. In the great courts of the Caliphates, power was not expressed only through armies, taxes, or towering palaces. It was expressed through sound, through rhythm, through carefully chosen words spoken at exactly the right moment. A ruler who surrounded himself with poets and musicians was not indulging in luxury for its own sake. He was making a statement about authority, order, and divine favor. To rule well was to rule beautifully. Eloquence mattered because it suggested control over language, over culture, over chaos itself. A refined court implied a refined ruler, and refinement was read as legitimacy. In a world where dynasties rose and fell quickly, appearing chosen by fate, God or destiny was as important as military strength. Poetry helped make that case. Courts were rarely quiet. Even formal gatherings pulsed with recitation, song, and debate. Poets declaimed verses praising victories, generosity, and wisdom. Musicians filled the air between conversations. Silence was uncomfortable. Silence invited uncertainty. Words filled that space and shaped how power was perceived. Poetry also preserved memory. Battles faded, but verses lasted. A single poem could define how a caliph was remembered long after his armies dispersed. This made poets dangerous and valuable at the same time. Their praise could immortalize, their satire could destroy. A ruler who ignored poets did so at his own risk. Music played a similar role. Skilled singers were prized not only for beauty, but for discipline and mastery. Musical knowledge was associated with education, cosmology, and order. To appreciate music properly was to understand harmony, a concept that extended neatly into politics and theology. A court that sounded harmonious suggested a realm that was too. This culture did not mean courts were gentle places. Behind the performances were rivalries, intrigues, and sudden reversals of fortune. But poetry and song softened the edges, creating an image of balance even when the reality was unstable. In the Caliphate courts, words were not decoration. They were currency. They purchased favour, protected reputations, and shaped power itself. A well-turned line could travel farther than a decree, linger longer than a threat, and leave a deeper mark than force ever could. In the Caliphate courts, poets were never just artists. They were political instruments with excellent memories and very sharp tongues. To invite a poet into your presence was to invite both praise and risk. A single verse could secure a patron's legacy, or quietly dismantle it in front of an audience trained to listen closely. Court poets lived in a delicate position. They depended on patronage, gifts, and protection, yet they were expected to speak with confidence and originality. Too timid, and they were forgotten. Too bold, and they were punished. The best poets learned how to balance admiration with intelligence, flattery with restraint. Praise poetry was the safest path to success. Poems celebrating generosity, military victory, justice, or divine favour were rewarded with gold, robes, horses, and appointments. These verses circulated far beyond the palace. They were memorized, copied, and recited in other courts, markets, and gatherings. A successful poem didn't just flatter a ruler, it broadcast his image across the empire. But satire was the real weapon. A biting verse could reduce a rival to ridicule in a society that valued honor deeply. Satirical poetry didn't need to be long. A few clever lines could stick in the public imagination and prove impossible to erase. For this reason, satire was both feared and controlled. Some rulers tolerated it as a sign of confidence. Others crushed it immediately. Poets understood this power. Many cultivated ambiguity, crafting lines that could be interpreted as praise or criticism depending on the listener. This gave them protection and flexibility. If challenged, a poet could claim misunderstanding. The audience, however, usually understood exactly what was meant. Rival courts competed for talent. A famous poet moving from one patron to another was a political event. It signaled shifts in influence and favour. Losing a respected poet was embarrassing. Gaining one was a victory. Yet poets were never fully safe. Patronage could vanish overnight. A verse remembered too well could resurface at the wrong moment. Some poets rose to great wealth. Others ended in exile, prison, or silence. In the Caliphate courts, poetry was not decoration. It was a force that could build reputations, wound pride, and reshape power, all without drawing a single sword. If poetry ruled the intellect of the court, music ruled its atmosphere. In the Caliphate courts, music was not background noise or casual amusement. It was treated as a serious discipline, tied to education, philosophy, and even theology. A ruler who valued music signaled not indulgence, but cultivation. Musicians were trained rigorously. Mastery required years of study, memorization, and physical discipline. Modes, rhythms, and tonal systems were learned with the same seriousness as law or grammar. To understand music properly was to understand harmony, proportion, and balance. concepts believed to reflect the structure of the universe itself. This is why music carried moral weight. Certain melodies were thought to calm the soul, sharpen the mind, or inspire contemplation. Others were considered dangerous, capable of stirring excess emotion or moral weakness if used improperly. Court musicians had to navigate these beliefs carefully. What they played, when they played it, and for whom all mattered. Singers held especially high status. A gifted voice could move an audience faster than argument or command. Famous singers became celebrities of their age, remembered by name, style, and repertoire. Their performances were discussed, compared, and debated by scholars and courtiers alike. A successful performance could elevate the mood of an entire court and reflect positively on the ruler who hosted it. Music also structured court life. Formal gatherings followed, expected sequences of recitation and song. Even informal evenings had rules. Improvisation existed, but only within boundaries understood by everyone present. This balance between freedom and structure mirrored the political ideals of the court itself. Yet music was never entirely safe. Like poetry, it could imply criticism through tone or selection. A melancholy piece after a military failure spoke volumes without words. A triumphant melody could exaggerate success. Skilled musicians understood these subtleties and used them carefully. In the Caliphate courts, music was more than pleasure. It was a demonstration of order. Harmony suggested stability. Control suggested wisdom, and a court that sounded refined claimed to be aligned with a higher, divinely ordered reality, even when politics beneath the music were anything but harmonious. In the Caliphate courts, words were powerful precisely because they were public. A poem was rarely heard by just one person. It echoed through halls, gatherings, and retellings. That made praise valuable, and satire dangerous. Every poet knew that one line could secure a fortune or quietly ruin a life. Praise poetry followed familiar patterns, but familiarity did not mean simplicity. A good panegyric didn't just list virtues, it framed the ruler as inevitable. Victories were described as signs of destiny. Generosity became proof of divine favor. Justice was portrayed as effortless, natural, unquestionable. The audience wasn't meant to argue with the poem. They were meant to accept it. But praise had limits. Excessive flattery made a ruler look insecure. Subtlety mattered. The best poets knew when to restrain themselves, allowing the audience to admire the ruler without feeling manipulated. This was an art learned through survival. Satire worked differently. It thrived on precision. A satirical verse rarely attacked directly. It hinted. It exaggerated a flaw just enough to make it memorable. Cowardice might be framed as caution, greed as enthusiasm, arrogance as confidence taken one step too far. The audience filled in the rest. Because honor was central to elite culture, ridicule could wound more deeply than accusation. A satirical line repeated often enough became a reputation, and reputations were difficult to escape. For this reason, rulers kept close watch on who laughed, and how loudly. Some caliphs tolerated satire as proof of strength. Allowing criticism suggested confidence. Others responded harshly, seeing mockery as rebellion in miniature. The line between wit and insult was thin, and poets walked it carefully. Many poets mastered ambiguity as self-defense. Verses were layered, capable of being read as praise or criticism depending on context. If questioned, the poet could claim innocence. The audience, however, often understood exactly what was intended. This environment created constant tension. Poets were expected to be bold but not reckless, clever but not threatening, honest but not disruptive. Failure meant exile, imprisonment, or sudden silence. In the Caliphate courts, satire and praise were not opposites. They were two edges of the same blade. And every poet knew that wielding it required not just talent, but impeccable judgment. Because the court never forgot a verse spoken at the wrong moment. In the Caliphate courts, poetry didn't just express admiration or critique. It functioned as currency. A successful verse could be exchanged for gold, land, titles, protection, or access. Talent was valuable, but usefulness determined survival. Poets understood this economy instinctively. Recitation was a transaction. A poet offered words shaped to a patron's needs. In return came gifts, stipends, or invitations that kept careers alive. The exchange was rarely crude or explicit, but everyone understood the terms. Praise that pleased was rewarded. Praise that missed the mood was quietly ignored. Silence, in this context, was failure. This economy extended beyond the palace. A poet associated with a powerful patron gained prestige everywhere. His words carried weight because of where they were spoken. That prestige could be leveraged elsewhere, opening doors to other courts, wealthy families, and intellectual circles. Verse created networks long before contracts or official appointments. Poetry also mediated social tension. When disputes arose between elites, a poem could smooth relations without formal apology. Compliments embedded in verse allowed rivals to save face. Humor softened disagreements. Carefully chosen metaphors replaced blunt confrontation. This made poets valuable intermediaries in a culture that prized dignity. Musicians and singers participated in the same system. A performance that impressed the court elevated not just the performer, but everyone associated with them. Teachers, patrons, and fellow artists all benefited. Artistic success reflected collective refinement, but currency can devalue. As courts filled with poets, competition intensified. Audiences grew harder to impress. Innovation became risky. Some poets doubled down on complexity. Others leaned into clarity and emotional force. Each approach carried dangers. Failure was costly. A poet who lost favor didn't just lose income, he lost protection. Patronage insulated artists from rivals, accusations, and shifting politics. Without it, even past praise could be reinterpreted unfavorably. This economy of words shaped artistic behavior profoundly. Poems were crafted with an awareness of audience, timing, and political climate. Spontaneity was rare. Calculation was constant. In the Caliphate courts, verse circulated like coin. It moved power, defined relationships, and stored value in memory rather than vaults. To master poetry was not just to master language. It was to master survival in a world where words could feed you, shield you, or quietly destroy you. Although chronicles often center on male poets and patrons, women were essential to the musical and poetic life of Caliphate courts. Their presence shaped taste, performance, and transmission of culture in ways that were both influential and carefully controlled. To understand courtly song without them is to hear only half the music. Highly trained female singers and musicians were among the most prized figures at court. They memorized vast repertoires of poetry, mastered complex melodic systems, and understood how to read an audience with precision. A performance was not simply about vocal skill, it was about timing, expression, and restraint. The best performers could adjust mood instantly, moving a gathering from reflection to delight, with subtle changes in tone. These women were often educated by elite teachers in literature, grammar, music, and etiquette. Their training could surpass that of many male courtiers. A refined singer was expected to understand poetry deeply enough to interpret it, not merely repeat it. Improvisation, when allowed, demonstrated intelligence as much as artistry. Their influence extended beyond entertainment. Taste spread through imitation. Styles introduced in court performances appeared later in private gatherings, cities, and distant regions. Musical preferences became cultural signals. To favor certain modes or poets marked one's alignment with sophistication and power. Yet this influence existed within strict boundaries. Visibility did not mean freedom. Performers depended entirely on patronage and protection. Favor could elevate them quickly. Loss of favor could erase them just as fast. Their brilliance did not shield them from politics. In fact, it often drew more attention. Despite these limits, women played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting artistic traditions. Songs were remembered through repetition. Poems survived through performance. Memory lived in voices. Without these performers, much of courtly culture would have vanished. Their presence also softened power. A ruler who surrounded himself with accomplished artists appeared cultured, merciful, and attuned to beauty. That image mattered. It humanized authority without weakening it. In the Caliphate courts, women's voices shaped sound, memory, and refinement. Often unnamed in records, they nonetheless carried the culture forward, verse by verse, note by note, sustaining an art form that defined an age. Caliphate courts were not unified cultural spaces. They were competitive ecosystems where talent was currency and rivalry was constant. Poets and musicians did not simply perform for appreciation. They performed to survive, to rise, and to outshine everyone standing beside them. Prestige was limited. Favor was finite. Someone always lost when someone else succeeded. Courts attracted talent from across the empire. This created dense artistic populations where comparison was unavoidable. Audiences remembered who impressed them last. Patrons noticed patterns. A poet who repeated himself too often faded quickly. A musician who failed to innovate risked being replaced. Excellence was not enough. It had to be continuous. Rivalries formed naturally. Poets critiqued one another through verse, sometimes openly, sometimes through clever allusion. A line mocking a rival's style or intellect could circulate discreetly, earning laughter without requiring confrontation. Musicians competed through refinement, introducing subtle variations that only trained listeners noticed. Recognition from elites mattered more than popularity. Patrons encouraged this competition. A court filled with sharp minds reflected well on its ruler. Rivalry kept performances sharp and reputations high, but it also created tension. Alliances formed, cliques emerged, favor shifted unpredictably. Today's celebrated poet could be tomorrow's afterthought. Mobility intensified these dynamics. Talented figures moved between courts, carrying styles and reputations with them. Their arrival disrupted hierarchies. Established artists felt threatened. Patrons weighed novelty against loyalty. Choosing whom to elevate was a political decision as much as an artistic one. Failure was rarely dramatic. More often, it was quiet. Invitations stopped. Performances were shortened. Praise cooled. The absence of attention was the clearest signal that a career was ending. Some artists adapted, reinventing themselves. Others left court life entirely, turning to teaching, copying, or obscurity. This constant pressure shaped the art itself. Innovation became careful. Risk was calculated. Too much novelty alienated audiences. Too little bored them. The most successful artists learned how to change just enough to stay indispensable. In the Caliphate courts, talent was celebrated, but never secure. Art thrived in an environment of competition, ambition, and insecurity. And it was this tension, not comfort, that pushed poetry and music to heights that would echo far beyond the palace walls. For all their refinement, Caliphate courts never forgot that art existed within a moral and religious framework. Poetry and music were admired, even celebrated, but they were also scrutinized. The same verse that delighted an audience could provoke discomfort if it crossed invisible lines. Talent did not grant immunity from belief. Debates about music and poetry ran deep. Some scholars argued that music elevated the soul, aligning it with divine harmony. Others warned that it distracted from devotion, encouraged excess, or stirred dangerous emotions. These arguments were not abstract. They shaped what was allowed in court and how openly it could be performed. As a result, discipline mattered. Courtly art was expected to appear controlled, measured, and purposeful. Excessive sensuality, explicit themes, or emotional abandon invited criticism. Performers learned to suggest rather than display. Longing was implied. Joy was refined. Even pleasure had rules. Poetry navigated similar boundaries. Love poetry flourished, but it was often framed through metaphor, nature, or spiritual language. Wine poetry existed, sometimes openly, sometimes coyly, depending on the ruler and climate of the court. A permissive caliph might enjoy bold imagery. A stricter one required restraint. Artists learned to read these moods carefully. Religious language often blended seamlessly into art. Praise of God, fate, and divine order appeared alongside praise of rulers. This was not accidental. Aligning political authority with spiritual harmony strengthened legitimacy. A court that sounded pious as well as cultured appeared properly ordered. This balancing act required intelligence. Artists who ignored religious sensibilities risked condemnation or exclusion. Those who leaned too heavily into moralism risked boredom. The most successful figures fused elegance with propriety, pleasure with reverence. Faith also provided protection. A poem framed as spiritual reflection was harder to attack. A song tied to accepted tradition gained legitimacy. Artists used belief not only as inspiration, but as armor. In the Caliphate courts, art did not challenge faith directly. It negotiated with it. Boundaries were tested gently, then respected. Creativity flourished not in defiance but in careful conversation with moral authority, a conversation that shaped the tone, limits, and enduring power of courtly culture. When the Caliphate courts faded, the armies dispersed, and palaces changed hands, poetry and song remained. They outlasted the political structures that nurtured them because they were never confined to stone walls. They lived in memory, recitation, and imitation. Long after rulers were reduced to names in chronicles, their verses continued to circulate. Court poetry shaped literary standards for generations. Metaphors, meters, and themes refined in elite settings filtered outward into cities, schools, and private gatherings. What began as performance became canon. Poets who once depended on patronage became authorities, studied by scholars who had never seen a caliph. Music followed the same path. Courtly modes and styles influenced regional traditions, religious recitation, and later artistic forms. Techniques developed to impress small elite audiences found wider expression over time. The sound of the court became part of cultural memory, even when stripped of its original context. This legacy was selective. Not everything survived. Performers disappeared. Names were forgotten. What remained were fragments, verses copied into manuscripts, melodies remembered imperfectly, reputations preserved unevenly. Yet even in fragments, the influence is unmistakable. What made this culture endure was not luxury, but intention. Poetry and song were treated as serious acts. They mattered enough to be debated, rewarded, and feared. That seriousness gave them weight. Art created under pressure often lasts longer than art created in comfort. The courts believed refinement reflected divine order. Whether that belief was sincere or strategic, it shaped artistic ambition. Artists were encouraged to aim high, not merely to entertain. That ambition echoes across centuries. Today, when we read or hear traces of this tradition, we are hearing more than aesthetics. We are hearing power speaking softly, faith negotiating with pleasure, and individuals carving permanence out of sound. In the Caliphate courts, poetry and song were not distractions from rule. They were part of how rule was understood. And long after the courts themselves vanished, their voices still linger, shaping how culture remembers power, beauty, and the fragile human desire to be heard.